Hello and welcome. I'm Sam Califer, your host for Vision, the show where we talk all about the College of Arts and Sciences as well as its faculty and students. Today I'm joined by Dr. Ben Crider, an associate professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, where he teaches and researches nuclear physics. Thanks so much for joining.
Greetings.
Yeah, happy to have you on and talk about all the great work you do. But first, I was hoping you could just introduce yourself, talk about your professional experience and how you came to Mississippi State.
All right, well, thanks for having me. So I am from a small town in Virginia outside of Richmond called Mechanicsville, Virginia. And growing up, I was always interested in science. And like many scientists that I know, my story in physics sort of began with that excellent mentor, and that was my high school teacher who really got me interested in doing physics at a young age. And so fortunately, I was able to get a scholarship at the University of Richmond where I was able to pursue a major in physics. And it was there at Richmond that my interest in not just physics, but actually experimental nuclear physics really sort of grew. And that was through my opportunities of working with Professor Cornelius Bosang. He basically had an entire research program in experimental nuclear physics and had a way of offering me an opportunity to actually engage that program by spending my summers at Yale University doing just that at the Wright Nuclear Structure Laboratory. And so I was able to get that hands-on experience doing nuclear physics as an undergraduate, and I decided I wanted to continue pursuing that as a possible career path by going to graduate school, where I went to the University of Kentucky and worked with Professor Steve Yates to continue my nuclear physics education. And at the University of Kentucky, they have a Van de Graaff accelerator, which is actually, the Van de Graaff is the same kind of nuclear physics demonstration device that we use that you may have seen where kids put their hand on this dome and their hair stands up straight. We use a similar kind of device, although a lot bigger and much higher voltage, to accelerate charged particles where we then produce neutrons and scatter them off of targets. And so I was able to really get a hands-on experience at a lab run by graduate students and postdocs, and then was able to carry that experience on to Michigan State University as a postdoctoral research scholar. Michigan State University at the time was the National Superconducting Cyclotron Lab, is now the facility for Rare Isotope Beams, and I was actually able to propose and perform experiments at that big user facility with Professor Sean Liddick doing beta decay studies of these exotic nuclei. And it was my experiences there in performing these experiments that met pretty well with the job posting for the position that I have now here at Mississippi State University, and I guess the rest, as they say, is history.
Sure, yeah, and it's a very specific and technical field, and so I'm glad we could get you on board and have a place for you here at the university. Yeah, and it's so interesting, but at the same time, I think it's something that is intimidating to a lot of people, and so that's why I wanted to have you on and just talk about how interesting it is. And so to start, I was hoping you could just talk about, what kind of topics do you research, what might a typical experiment look like, and what types of information are you trying to discover?
Right, and so it can be an intimidating topic, but the hope is that we can also make it a really exciting topic, and getting to play with some of the toys involved in nuclear physics experiments, I think helps make that a lot of the excitement for me. And so the research I do is actually at a variety of different experimental nuclear physics facilities across the country. I do work at Los Alamos National Laboratory in the University of Kentucky, where I utilize beams of neutrons and actually scatter them off of different target material to study the nuclear reactions and the probabilities with which they occur using these neutrons. And on the other hand, I also study these so-called exotic nuclei, which I'll talk more in a little bit, at places like the Facility for Rare Isotope Beams. And so across all of these different facilities, the sort of beginning of all of this is a big particle accelerator. And so what we do is we accelerate beams of different particles or nuclei themselves to high energies, and then we sort of smash them into targets and try to see what kind of nuclear reactions occur and what radiation gets emitted in order to understand something about the overall nuclear strong force, or one of these fundamental forces of nature, and how it interacts and decides how matter is sort of formed. And so in order to study this emitted radiation that tells us about these interactions, we use these large arrays of detectors. And you may have seen some similar arrays in pictures where they fill up a giant room or a hangar. For ours, they fill up more of like a small room, like a college dorm room, and so on. And these arrays of detectors are different types of detector materials that are specific for getting a certain piece of information out, whether it's timing information or energy information about individual radiation like neutrons or gamma radiation, which is just high energy light. And so we kind of try to compile these pieces of information together. If I may use an analogy, it's like pieces of a puzzle that as we analyze the data, we try to put back together to put the puzzle all at one. And it's a little bit beyond that, because then we have to use theories of how we understand the interactions of the nuclear strong force to proceed. We use these theoretical predictions and calculations to not just have a picture, but try to also know what that picture is and what it's telling us.
Sure, yeah, and I think a lot of people have heard about running a particle accelerator, and you're doing certain experiments on these different elements to see how they react. And it's super interesting, and I think it's also more real world than people might expect. That's what happens in space a lot of the time, and any type of like energy that we're trying to create, like radioactive energy, that's kind of where your work comes into place. It helps us understand the universe. Absolutely. And make more efficient forms of energy. So super interesting, and it's just different pieces of a puzzle, but sometimes that one discovery you make could really have such a big impact. And so interesting. And a recent project that you're working on, you had mentioned it before, you're part of the first experiment at the new facility for rare isotope beams. You're doing some groundbreaking research trying to measure how long exotic nuclei will survive at the edge of stability,
right?
Which is a mouthful. So could you try to explain that? What does that mean in layman's terms, and what impacts do you hope the project can have?
Yeah. And so exotic nuclei is just a term we use in nuclear physics to describe nuclei that exist for very short amounts of time before they decay into other nuclei or other configurations of protons and neutrons. And this time frame is really short, such as a few seconds or even just a few milliseconds in some of the most exotic nuclei that we've produced to date. And so, yeah, the experiments that I do at Facility for Rare Isotope Beams are trying to understand what are the limits to which nuclei even form at all, meaning how do you get nucleus, which is a large or a small clumping of protons and neutrons, why do those form compared to just the individual protons or neutrons themselves? And so it just so happens that the nuclear strong force provides a overall reduction in the energy of the system so that they form nuclei. And so you can kind of, by analogy, compare this to a ball rolling down a hill. The reason a ball rolls down the hill is because it's trying to have an overall reduction of the energy of that system. And so that's why a nucleus forms, and it's also why a nucleus decays, because the nucleus that forms isn't necessarily the most stable nucleus you can have. So it might radioactive decay to another nuclear species, so it can overall reduce that energy again and again. So nuclear radiation is like the nucleus's way of sort of rolling down a hill of sorts. And just like a ball reaches the bottom of a hill, so too will a nucleus reach its sort of minimum energy that the system can have, and that's what we call stable nuclei. And those stable nuclei are the things we find all around us, right? The thing this chair is made of, and so on. But as we kind of study that, we have a lot of understanding of what's going on for these type of nuclei. But we actually don't understand so well what happens in these ultra exotic nuclei that are actually only found in like the most exotic places in the universe, like stars or supernovae or the merging of stars. And so we're really trying to attack and enhance our understanding of how these nuclei form at all. And then by understanding how long they live, we can kind of get a feel for just how unstable they are and make predictions of when a nucleus would form at all compared to when there's just too much energy, too many nucleons in the system that they'll never go together and form a nucleus at all.
Sure, yeah, and I think anyone who takes like a high school chemistry class learns about how a couple of decades ago they were discovering new elements. Is this the kind of the way they do it? Like some of these super radioactive elements, they only exist for a second, but it's this is how they discover it. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
So cool, there's elements out there in the universe that we don't know about unless someone's doing the research that you do. So super interesting, and I'm glad we could talk about that. We've got a couple more minutes. I wanted to pivot because something I thought was really interesting. Earlier this year, you used part of your NSF career funds to host a super interactive summer experience for students with autism, so they could learn about physics and other related topics. So could you just tell me about that and what were the students' reactions?
Yeah. So you were right, my NSF career grant enabled me to host last year the inaugural physics summer camp for students with ASD, and overall it was a fantastic experience. If I can describe the camp, it was basically designed to have a topic for each day. So in each day we had physics topics that we would explore, and these topics range from electricity and magnetism to aerodynamics to astronomy and nuclear physics. And so the way we set up the camp is we wanted the mornings to sort of be an introduction to the topic, and the students have an opportunity to have hands-on interactive demos related to the topic, and also perform little experiments related to that topic. And then in the afternoons, we would then also take an excursion somewhere nearby usually to then explore how that topic might actually be used in either the field of research or even in industry. And so for afternoon excursions, we were able to go to places like the High Voltage Laboratory here on campus, the RASPET Flight Research Laboratory, Rainwater Observatory at French Camp, and the Institute for Clean Energy Technology here. And so the students got that, they really enjoyed that overall experience. As part of the camp, they stayed on campus and stayed in the dorms here, so they also got an exposure to what a possible four-year educational experience might look like somewhere here, like here at Mississippi State University. And in the evenings, we kind of treated the kids to different social-based interactions, try to help with that aspect. And we got to do fun things like visit the virtual reality lab, do a movie night, have a fun night at the Sanderson Center, and things like that. So it was a lot of fun. It was excellent feedback from the students, and they basically just loved the camp, and we're just really excited about being able to host it again in year 2 this summer.
Sure, well, I just really appreciate that. You're doing the high-end physics work, but just the same way you were encouraged by a mentor early on, you're keeping that spirit alive, and hopefully these students will find the same passion. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Happy to do it, and thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Vision. We'll see you next time.